Slashers have a way of being grounded in reality depending on which one you watch, and this franchise is no stranger to that fact, no pun intended. The Strangers franchise has been growing recently, and that allowed me to come to the realization that maybe the Strangers weren't always what we thought they were. Despite them fitting the mold perfectly with their creepy masks, melee weapons, stalking their victims, and of course teleporting through shadows, I asked myself the question, has the Strangers franchise always been rooted in the slasher genre? In this video, I'll give my analysis on when I believe the Strangers fully planted their seeds in the soil of the slasher genre. Before I get into when I believe the Strangers became a slasher, which is pretty obvious considering there's only 3 films currently released within this franchise at the time of me making this, let's go back to the release of the Strangers in 2008 and see the inspiration for this film and the franchise. The inspiration for how the Strangers came to be came from real life stories, including a personal story from the writer and director of the 2008 film, Brian Bertino. The 3 inspirations were the murder of Sharon Tate, the Kitty Cabin murders of 1981, and his own personal experience with break-ins when he was younger. According to Medium.com, I was thinking about the Tate murders and realizing that these detailed descriptions had painted a story of what it was like in the house with the victims, but none of the victims knew about the Manson family or why it was happening to them. So I got really fascinated with telling the victim's tale and not filling it in with an FBI profile and not filling it in with finding out that somebody's grandmother beat them and now they want to kill everybody. You read obituaries every day where someone is killed for a random reason. Yes, we may eventually find out why, but sometimes they don't. The article continued, as a child, while his parents were out, Bertino got a knock at the door by a stranger asking for someone who didn't live there. While his home wasn't invaded, the experience was that he would hear the break-ins of other homes that were empty while the homeowners were gone, rather leaving alone the houses where the people were home. Now, the final inspiration was not stated directly from Brian Bertino himself, but the article goes on to say, finally, the Kitty Cabin murders of 1981 had the inspiration for not just the rural setting, but also the fact that the perpetrators got away. Although Bertino didn't actually cite this massacre as inspiration, journalists have drawn parallels between the two.
When I was a kid, I went up to stay with my grandmother in a small town, and as I was leaving, I was around 11 or 12 years old. My dad gave me a book to read, and he gave me Helter Skelter, which was a very strange pick, and I had no idea what it was, but I kind of I read it over this week and a half and got really interested in it, and what grabbed me about it wasn't Charles Manson and wasn't the mythology of the family. It was the idea that the book laid out in so many details. It drew me into those nights where these murders occurred, and I started to get fascinated with the idea that I'm reading a book that is telling me everything about what happened with these murders, but for the people that were in the house, they had no idea. So I kind of started that interest in the idea of looking at victims in these kind of cases, in these famous cases, and thinking what happened to them. And then as I continue to think about scary stories, I remembered another incident that was around that time where I had been in a house with my little sister that was very similar to the house in the Strangers, out in the middle of nowhere, and a group of people had gone and knocked on doors, and they were knocking on every door on the street with the idea that whoever didn't open the door, they would kick in the door and rob the place. And my little sister at 7 years old actually answered the door and saw these people and talked to them, and they asked for some fake name or something, and she didn't know who that person was, and so they went to the next house. And I remember thinking, even back then, like, God, if they had kicked in the door, what would we have done? And so those two things, were really kind of the beginning place for, I wanted to tell a story from the point of view of somebody's you read about in an obituary or something like that.
So it's safe to say why the first film feels really grounded in reality and so hauntingly real. When I watched The Strangers, released in 2008, it didn't give me a slasher vibe, and that's not to say that slashers have to have a specific vibe. What I mean by that is The Strangers felt so grounded in reality that putting it in the slasher genre didn't really make sense to me. When I watch a slasher, even if it doesn't have the theatrics or the over-the-top blood and other cliches that come with slasher films, it still has a vibe that goes, okay, this is a slasher film. The Strangers didn't feel that way at all to me, and I'm definitely not saying that as an insult either. That's what made the film terrifying to me. Though it was fictional, it carried itself as if the events that took place actually happened.
Stop.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre, released in 1974, is what comes to mind if I can give another example of this within the slasher genre, despite it still having the slasher vibe. Both films really commit to the bit of being and feeling real, so much so that it left audiences questioning whether or not the stories were actually true even to this day. I'm telling y'all, younger me said Texas was off limits and you couldn't pay me to go there. I say all that to say that The Strangers felt more like a home invasion film than a slasher film to me. That is, until the release of The Strangers Prey at Night, released in 2018. The vibe of that film did a full 180 upon its release, which I also feel is the reason why the reception for that film compared to the first one is very different. People were expecting something more rooted in reality, a thriller or a home invasion type film. Neither films are bad in my personal opinion. I really enjoyed both of them for what they were presented as. The Strangers being a dark, terrifying home invasion film, and The Strangers Prey at Night being a slasher film. So if it isn't painfully obvious by now, this is when The Strangers became slashers. I told you when this franchise became a slasher franchise. However, I wanted to go more in depth on how and why that is. I'm going to compare the two films through these 4 categories: storytelling, visuals, characters, and the slashers themselves. So comparing the start of both films, the vibe is already completely different. When we look at The Strangers opening, it opens with an ominous narrator reading off the words on the screen that give facts about violent crimes in America and referencing the characters as if they are real people.
On the night of February 11th, 2005, Kristen McKay and James Hoyt left a friend's wedding reception and returned to the Hoyt family's summer home.
Already putting you in that mindset that this actually happened, even though it didn't. Now, when we look at the opening of The Strangers Prey at Night, we are already introduced to the strangers, which makes sense to do because we already know who they are. But the vibe is different because they pull up to a mobile home park bumping We're the Kids in America by Kim Wilde. It was released in 1981 for my British peoples and 1982 for my American peoples. I mention this because slashers became wildly mainstream in the 80s, so I believe that's why the audience's minds go straight to the slasher films instead of the tone that The Strangers in 2008 brought. Before I continue, I understand that Prey at Night also had based on a true story pop up at the beginning of their film. However, I feel having that come up doesn't really alter the tone that they were going for with the second film, which I believe is a slasher tone. So even though it said based off of a true story, it didn't really ground itself in reality and commit to that like the first film did. Continuing with the opening scenes, The Strangers from 2008 showed flashes of different homes and then went to a shot of the 2 little boys walking up to a house of destruction with a 911 call they made playing over the scene.
911, what's your emergency? There are people here. Okay, calm down. Where are you?
911 calls are commonly used in film and media when people reference and give context to real-life events. So this is another detail that really allows this film to ground itself in reality. Then we get to a title card that's very simple with a dark, foreboding score going on in the background.
It's everywhere. Jordan, what happened? There's blood everywhere.
The Strangers Prey at Night Uno reversed and dished the subtlety it had previously done and went full dramatics with a very intense score playing as Dollface stalks the owners of the mobile home until they are killed off screen, and then we're introduced to a very dramatic title card of red spinning cloth, I believe, and The Strangers Prey at Night title fading in with a very distinct font. Also, I can't forget the 80s-like score with synths, maybe because I'm not a musician, but it was definitely pulling in that 80s tone to the film. The introduction to the characters we followed throughout both films is completely different. In The Strangers, we are introduced to Kristen and James, which I just peeped James's last name is Hoyt, and I mean Sheriff Hoyt. Is this a coincidence? I think not. But let's continue. The tone in which we are introduced to Kristen and James is very dark. There's no happy smiles and talks. However, you can say that the reason for that is because of a rift in their relationship. And by rift, I mean a ginormous gulf.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
I feel this is done in a way that feels like, and this may sound weird, but like a drama film, but not theatrical. It wants you to feel the rift in this couple's relationship and not the fact that this is a horror film that's introducing you to characters, because this film really focuses on how the couple feels throughout the entire film. However, in The Strangers Pray at Night, we are introduced to a family with troubles, but the vibe is more upbeat. Think of the happy campers in the Friday the 13th franchise who don't know that the last thing that they will see during their trip is a hockey mask. We know the family dynamic's right, but it doesn't feel as dramatic or intense as the relationship dynamic between Kristen and James. This isn't to say that the relationship dynamic wasn't done well in the second film either. I'm basically comparing the tone and approach of the relationships in both films. Before I skip ahead, another thing that I found to be very common in slasher films is the fact that you usually get a kill within the first 15 to 20 minutes of the film. Whether it be off screen or on screen, not only setting the tone for the type of film it's going to be, but also introducing you to the slasher of this film. Now, this formula isn't always chosen. However, I believe from all the slashers I've seen, this is common, and the fact that The Strangers doesn't do that and Pray at Night does, I feel also says a lot about the tone of both films, and The Strangers 2008 doesn't technically show a kill, just the aftermath of what happened that night. Now, as we travel along the journey of both ensembles, we are introduced to The Strangers in a very different way. In The Strangers, the famous "Is Tamara home" line is used. However, the first time Dollface comes around, she asks, "Is Tamara here?" And afterwards, the strangers travel throughout the shadows of the cabin that Kristen and James are staying in and go straight into their psychological torture of one of the main protagonists, Kristen. On the other hand, even though Pray at Night does introduce the family to the strangers through the "Is Tamara home" line, it's done in a very slasher genre way. Here's the killer or killers you know, and here are their next victims, which I believe makes sense because we already know the strangers. However, I can't deny that it does impact the tone of the film. Also, Pray at Night does this twice, with the second time being used as upping the tension in the film, and I believe this assists in making this feel like more of a slasher film, because every slasher has their thing. Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees have their music cues, so you not only know who they are, but you also know that terror is afoot, and similar to that is the "Is Tamara home" line given in this film. It became a cue for the audiences to know that terror is on its way, and not a tactic done by them to see who's in the house and if anyone's home. I do like the detail given in both films when it comes to the porch lights, and shows that she unscrewed it before knocking so that her face won't be clear to the victims of the house. Both of the ensembles are psychologically tortured in different ways by the strangers. In the Strangers film, they do little things like messing with the fire alarm, cutting the power line so that Kristen can stay on the phone with James, making noises, cutting charges, and skipping records. In Pray at Night, they do what we know well from the slasher genre and leave mutilated bodies for all to see, including the victims of the film.
What?
Even how they attack both ensembles is different. The strangers in the first film do physically attack James and Kristen at some point in the film, but they attack them mentally more than anything, really playing up that tension and causing James to kill his own friend because of it.
Hello.
Pray at Night goes mostly on attack physically, using brute force most of the time like your average slasher. When it comes to the actual strangers themselves, they are very different. However, I just want to give a shout out to both designs for the slashers in both films, because I think it's very underestimated at how it impacts and increases your fear of the strangers subconsciously. If you think about the designs very carefully, it's scary because they're wearing very specific and bright clothes. Why is that scary? Because that means that they're going in with the utmost confidence that they weren't going to get caught. So to them, it doesn't matter what they have on or how specific it is, because the plan is to kill the victims, so they won't be allowed to remember it anyway. That even ups the disturbing factor of them wearing the mask, because if you watch the first film, they reveal their faces to the victims but not the audience, which means that the masks are only there as a game for them. And I think that's just a genius design when it comes to the slashers. Okay, I'm done geeking out now. Let's get back on topic of the Strangers' behaviors. The Strangers in Prey at Night are more dramatic and interactive than the first film. When they speak, it's done through the theatrics of this version of the Strangers. Like when Pinup Girl came out from the darkness in the large pipe-like thing, I don't know what it's called, I'm not a construction worker, to scare Kenzie.
But we've just started.
It's an odd thing to say, especially when you consider that the Strangers did talk in the first film. However, it felt more strategic to impact the characters in the film versus the audience. I think these changes allowed it to feel more like a slasher film because it pulls you out of the realism because of how we were introduced to the Strangers in the first place. They even do a face reveal for Dollface and have Man in a Mask, the credit listed for this specific killer, literally driving a truck that was on fire, by the way, going after Kenzie, the daughter of the second film. Mind you, that truck blew up with him in it beforehand. All this is happening while Making Love Out of Nothing at All by artist named Air Supply, another 80s track, blasts in the background. The film being filled with 80s tracks solidifies to me that they were definitely going for more of a slasher vibe with this film. Even when we analyze the chosen characters for both films, Kristen and James seem more rooted in reality because it's just the two of them. A slasher film usually has an ensemble cast because they have to be picked off one by the chosen slasher or slashers of the film. Even though it's not always the case, it's still done most of the time. The Strangers doesn't do that and forces you to go on the agonizing journey with these two characters until the end of the film, whereas with Prey at Night, the ensemble cast allows you to experience terror but quickly move on to the next kill until we get to the final showdown with the final girl, just like a slasher film. The Strangers follow characters trying to survive an unexpected home invasion, so the goal for them is to survive and for us to be shown how they are experiencing this kind of home invasion. Another thing that causes the second film to feel more like a slasher is the brighter colors used versus the darker, more natural colors used in the first film. The color palette chosen for the first film once again grounds us in reality a bit more than the color palette chosen for the second film. Prey at Night even has a scene at a pool with bright neon colors, very reminiscent of the 80s, which once again was a time where slashers were thriving. Now let's compare the ending of both films. When it comes to The Strangers, the ending was a very unfortunate and simple setup. They tie them up and get their last stabs in. It was very drawn out and something that as a viewer I just wanted to hurry up and be over. From Kristen begging and pleading and asking why to the haunting answer that still sends chills down my spine to this day.
Because you were home.
All the way to Kristen and James trying to power through the pain of each stab. It was almost sickening to watch, like the recounts of an actual terrifying event. Of course, it has the classic one last jump scare scene at the end though. Slasher films end very differently in general compared to other subgenres within the horror genre. They have more of a final showdown feel than something gruesome, even though it's very possible for a slasher to achieve that unbearable ending, of course, because I'm pretty sure it's been done many times before with all the slashers that have been released. However, I believe the focus is on the final girl and her taking down the slasher once and for all. That's something I believe Prey at Night accomplished. You have Kenzie and the Man in the Mask final showdown ending off with her hitting him over the head with the bat to take him out. You even have the reference to the classic Texas Chainsaw Massacre of 1974, where Sally escapes through the back of a pickup truck driving off into the sunset. We then figure out that she's no longer a final girl once we see her brother alive in the hospital as well. Then the film ends off with one last knock at the door and Kenzie with a terrified look on her face. Now this can be seen as your classic ending to a slasher where the killer is never really dead, or it can be interpreted as Kenzie having some trauma to unpack in the future, especially considering this came out in 2018, a time where analyzing something like trauma in a horror film was the foundation of the film rather than the subplot. I say that because I believe that horror, slashers included, have always analyzed things like trauma, mental health, etc. This isn't to say that it has always been done correctly or perfectly, but it has always existed for sure, which is something that I discussed in my double feature video way back when. Have slashers always been elevated on my channel? That video wasn't the best and clearly stated my opinion on the topic, so I may revisit it and give it a bit of a remake with fresher eyes, but let's continue. Now that I've told you when I believe the Strangers franchise fully committed to the slasher genre and compared the Strangers and The Strangers Pray at Night, I would like to talk a bit about why the audience wasn't really accepting of the sequel to The Strangers and how it could have been done. I believe I mentioned this a bit earlier, but the audience wasn't accepting of the sequel because of the tone shift between both films. I like both films. However, I can understand how someone who really liked the first film and how grounded it was in reality wouldn't really take to the second film, i.e. the committed to the slasher genre film. The tones did a full 180 compared to the first one, and the wild thing is I can see someone liking the second film of the franchise, so they decided to go back and watch the first one and like that one too. So it was really more about the people who liked the tone of the first one and were really locked in on terror grounded in realism versus theatrical terror given in slasher films. It's all about the preference of the audience, and their core audience was introduced to a whole new set of strangers in the second film. The thing I would have done differently when it came to The Strangers Pray at Night to not only keep the core audience but still have the essence of a slasher film is to keep the foundation of the strangers by adding the things that they added in the film to go for the vibe they wanted. Before I continue, I do want to say that going the route of making it seem like it was based on a true story kind of hindered the smooth sailing of The Strangers becoming a franchise, because people already have it set in their minds that okay, this happened once by some really sick people. However, doing it again and again could lead to the audience being pulled out of the stories because it happened so many times. However, I still believe that that's the route it should have went. New victims every time from their perspective. In Pray at Night, the opening scene should have been the narrator and the introduction to the story, and then go straight to the family in their night of terror like the first one, or switch it up and have a 911 phone call introduce the audience to the new film instead, giving it a chilling and foreboding opening. The family drama should be focused on and feel more serious. Remember, we are looking at this from the perspective of the victims, so whatever matters to them in the moment is what matters to us, and what should be taken seriously even if it's not brought up again in the film. It wouldn't be off-putting because I feel that's realistic. If a couple is in the middle of a fight and then they get into a car crash, the last thing on their minds after that car crash is the fight they just had. What's important in that moment is surviving and getting to safety. Allow the strangers to keep their mysterious aesthetic. Don't have any full-on face reveals. I know that "Is Tamara home" is an iconic line for the strangers. However, to keep it more as a tactic and not a cue, change the name. So is Sarah home? Is John home? Is Jabari here? Etc, etc. I know that hearing that line would cue the audience anyway into what's happening. However, because we're feeling this film from the victim's perspective, don't play into that and allow it to feel new for the characters themselves. Keep psychological warfare at the forefront, moving little things, making noises, and making the characters question what they see or hear. Don't make the end goal of the ensemble cast to be picked off one by one, but to survive the best they can. Give us that point of view like Brian Bertino described in the video from earlier. Allow them all to be captured. However, if you do want to kill off a character before that, force the audience to sit in it. Don't just speed off to the next killer scene. Do all this while experimenting with lighting and colors in the new location. Play the 80s music through the characters and not the strangers. The music used in the first one was a tactic of convenience. The strangers didn't play the music to vibe, but to disorientate Kristen and James. Don't make all the things that cause the strangers to feel so grounded in reality become cues in the identity of the strangers themselves. Allow them to simply be tactics and switch those tactics up depending on the location, and for the sequel, that will be the mobile home park. However, this isn't to say that Pray at Night should have changed anything, because it was obvious that we're going for the slasher vibe, and I liked it because I like slashers. We have now come to the end of my analysis for The Strangers, and I just want to say that I thought long and hard about what video I wanted to transition me into making longer videos, and I'm glad it was this one because I had a really fun time making it. Also, just a reminder, because I know some people don't like Pray at Night compared to the first film, keep it to constructive criticism. It's okay to not like a film and say why you didn't. However, it is a way to do that. So let's keep the vibes good in those comments if you decide to comment. If you stayed this long, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you decided to subscribe for more content like this, and let me know what y'all think below. Remember to keep it kind. Peace.